She shut the door on me as if I were a stray cat at her doorstep. And when I stood there with my fingers still cold from the stair rail, she smiled and spoke as if I were a stranger asking for directions. "You must excuse me. That is how I begin. I will not lie to you with pretty slowing words. There is nothing poetic about a daughter turning away from the hand that once wiped her fevered brow. My face, my hands, the voice that had sung lullabies into midnight, meant nothing to the woman her reflection showed in the gilded mirror. That first moment, if you want to know why I tell the whole story, was when the soft thread that had bound us was cut, and the cut bled into everything that followed. The wound smelled of perfume and marble polish. I am an old woman. I remember my hands before they were spotted like the pewter of the old tin mugs I used to wash, before arthritis made my fingers knobby and slow. I keep a mason jar on the top shelf of my kitchen in a place where the sun touches it each morning. In that jar I have put pennies, dimes, and once a small silver ring that I swore to myself I would never sell. The jar is heavy with years and habit. It is my small altar to thrift and to the belief that little things, stacked, will help against large sorrows. I sleep with a chipped mug beside my bed, the one that has a hairline crack from the day the radio played the news of some distant war, and I dropped it in fright. The pearls, oh, those pearls, are tucked away in a narrow wooden box wrapped in tissue. The pearls my own mother pressed into my hands on my wedding day, each bead full of salt and wedding candles. Symbols, people call them. Odds and ends, I call them. And I will tell you how each one would become a key, a memory, and a weapon. My daughter, her name was always the proudest syllable of my speech, married well in the way that small towns gossip of as if it were a sudden miracle. Her husband had a briefcase that smelled of leather, and the smell carried into their first apartment, and later a house with columns. He made money. She made him proud in the way she arranged luncheon napkins and smiled with patience at charity galas. They bought a house with pillars and a marble foyer where the echoes of their laughter could be polished as easily as the floors. They had a gardener who trimmed hedges into sphinxes and a housekeeper who ironed tablecloths until they resembled small clouds. When I visited, I walked slowly because my knees protested, and they offered me espresso in small cups and, once, a plate with a thin slice of cake so carefully arranged it would make any ordinary tea feel like a celebration. They called me Mama in public and left me loving crumbs in the corners of their uninterrupted speeches. For years, our differences were gentle and folded into family life. I had my small apartment with the chipped mug, the mason jar, and a radio that never quite found the right station. I visited on Sundays for soup and on Thursdays when my daughter insisted she had time because, she said, Thursdays were quieter. The gardener did not mow the lawn on Thursdays. The housekeeper had errands. There was a man who came often around then. He called himself her cousin's son, or perhaps a friend of the family. His name sounded harmless, John or James, whichever name is ordinary enough for a man who wishes to be invisible. He would arrive on a Thursday and say he had come to visit his mom and sit at the foot of our conversation like a quiet, well-bred shadow. He always arrived on time, black coat like a cinder, and he always left with the hush of someone who had done a small private duty. He would kiss my daughter's cheek and call her by the nickname only family used. And sometimes when she pretended to look the other way, he would hand her envelopes that she tucked into a drawer with the small, precise motions of someone closing a book. I did not ask for the envelopes. What is a mother to do? I had given her everything I could. My best years, the pennies that went into the mason jar, the recipes with flour on their margins, the stories that smelled like broth. I thought love was a currency that could never be counted, but my daughter learned the language of counting, of ledgers, and she learned it well. She learned how to turn gratitude into an invoice and then discreetly erase the debt. Do you know that the first time I felt myself becoming smaller in my daughter's life, I blamed myself? I told myself perhaps I had been too loud with my memories, perhaps I had called too often, perhaps, a word dangerous for old women, perhaps I had asked for too much of what I had given. Who among you has not listened to that small voice that softens a complaint into an apology, that says, maybe I am wrong? So I apologized once, twice, and then I stopped apologizing because apologies were the coin my daughter had changed for silence. The first small betrayal was a seat at a luncheon avoided. I was told there was no room. The second was a "we'll call you" that came without a call. A neighbor once told me, fingers fluttering like moth wings, that my daughter had been seen at the bank talking to a law advisor on April 3rd, 2 days before the charity gala where she presided over the head table. I could see them in my mind, the lawyer's gray suit, the watch at his wrist, the look that lawyers always have when they are reading the underside of a person's fortune. April 3rd, mark the date, I thought, because dates are small anchors in the tide of time. On that day, a page was turned and no one told me I was on the wrong side of it. The little things are what sharpen a blade. She began to change the way she answered the phone. I would call and a voice would answer, "She can't come to the phone right now," as if I were an interruption in the middle of a composition. A photograph from my granddaughter's graduation arrived in the mail, but there was a face missing. Mine. My chin trembled as I looked at the glossy paper. I remember thinking the photo had been cut, like a moth-bitten cloth. The missing space in the picture felt like a hole in the world. Each omission was a season, and the seasons, like a stern teacher, continued their work. There were whispers in the rooms of people who never knew my name, and calls that were left unanswered. The house that once smelled faintly of my daughter's perfume smelled now of furniture polish and the faint scent of someone else's cologne that lingered like a secret. The man who visited his mom every Thursday was always there when I arrived, and always left with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He was punctual in that way that made me think him part clock, part compromise. He never stayed for soup. He never sat at the table when we ate. He simply stood for moments and spoke to my daughter in the small language of those who ration secrets like biscuits. One Thursday, I decided to bring the mason jar. I do not often carry it. It is for small savings and for the day the washing machine finally dies. But that day, my hands had found it like a talisman, and I took the jar to their house because I thought perhaps the sight of it would remind her of the smallness of what I kept. I arrived and the man in the black coat stood in the foyer with an envelope. He looked at the jar, and his look was not of curiosity. It was of measurement. He raised his brows as if he had been taught to measure people by their thrift. That evening, I went home with a cup of tea someone had poured for me in a tiny cup, and the taste of it was thin, like watered silk. Later, when I stood in the shallow light of my kitchen and returned the mason jar to the shelf, I found a paper tucked beneath the tissue that guarded the pearls. It was not mine, not at first glance, but a scrap, 5 words written in a hand that trembled with intention, durable power of attorney, and a date, April 3rd. I pressed my thumb to the ink as if to read the print of some vanished signet. My heart beat like an old engine, loud and uncoordinated. Durable power of attorney. The words were heavy with consequence. They were not lullabies. They meant someone could speak for me when my voice was no longer permitted. I felt as if my mouth had been sealed with wax. I did not understand the rules that had quietly stitched themselves around me. I knew only that things were being moved while I slept. A photograph in a drawer, an envelope slipped from a pocket, a name erased from a list. Little robberies, perhaps, but theft is a clever thing. It begins with dusting your hands on your apron and ends with a bank account's cool certainty. When the neighbor had told me of the lawyer and April 3rd, she had added, with the kind of gossip that pretends to be pity, that the sum involved was about $230,000 from a trust established by my late husband, a man who had buried his modest wages like a miser and who had always wanted his family to be comfortable. I had not imagined such numbers as mine. To me, $230,000 was a story on the radio or a price of a car. To my daughter, it was calculus. I wrote the number on an old napkin and folded it into the drawer where recipes lived with grease stains. My mason jar did not know this kind of number. It did not need to. Why would they do such a thing? I asked myself. Love, I hoped, was a language too soft to be taught. But greed is a teacher with strict methods. The man who visited every Thursday had begun to look more like a clerk of fate than a casual drop-in. He had the habit of touching a cuff whenever he laughed and of glancing at the clock as if it were a ledger. I began to watch him like a woman watching the weather, for patterns, For the direction of the wind. Little hints accumulated like buttons in a tin. A locked drawer, a piece of paper tucked behind a ledger. The sound of a quiet voice on a cordless phone saying, "Bring the originals. Bring them on Thursday." I heard that last phrase while pretending to adjust a picture frame in the hall. My hands shook so much that I dropped the frame and the glass shattered into small confessions on the floor. There is nothing quite like the sound of glass to awake neighbors and old wives. My daughter did not come running. The man in the black coat picked up the largest shard with gloved hands and set it down in the bin without a word. I began to visit more often, though she had apparently less time for me. I am nothing if not persistent. What is the point of living long if one gives up on small wars? So I persisted, as the ivy persists on stone. Sometimes I would sit on the bench outside and watch the way people entered and left the house. Human habits are telling things. Who takes the short path? Who lingers in the foyer? What hand carries what envelope? It is remarkable and quiet how much the world will show you if you simply refuse to look away. One afternoon, as rain mended the day with its steady, patient tapping, I heard a phone ring from within the house. The ring was the kind old-fashioned ring that does not belong to iPhones or devices. It was a ring that implied presence. There was a number displayed on the black corded receiver that my daughter had placed on a side table. The name said Estate Office, and the last digits matched the number I had seen on paperwork once, when my late husband had saved insurance statements in a shoebox. I did not move at first. Then my feet carried me to the window and I saw the man in the black coat answer the phone. He sat in the armchair, and his voice was all business. "Yes," he said. "We will proceed after the gala. The signature is ready." The word signature is a small punctuation in most lives. To me, it became a pistol shot. Who would be signing? Whose name would be given away like bread to a begging man? I pressed my hand to the glass, which made my reflection double against the rain. It was a thin, candle-lit version of myself, looking at a scene where I did not belong. Microscopic betrayals thicken into plots. Small acts of forgetting harden into destiny. I never expected what I found in that drawer. I will not paint my memory as a play of villains and an innocent mother. That is the child's story. I had faults. I had a voice that sometimes broke into impatience. I kept dates wrong on calendars, and I burned one batch of biscuits so thoroughly that the smell lingered for a week. But faults do not explain a man who visits his mom every Thursday and opens drawers like a locksmith with a map. There was something organized in the way they shunned me, something machine-like and unemotional. I began to note details. The time the gardener came, the way the household staff avoided my gaze when I asked for the recipe of a soup, the polite, practiced pauses when someone said my name. One morning, boldness or foolishness overcame me, and I met the man on the path. He was returning from the mailbox with a small white envelope in his hand. He stopped as if surprised to meet an old woman, and he offered a smile practiced in an office. "Good morning," he said. "Beautiful day." He had a way of lowering his voice that suggested he thought very well of secrets. "You come here every Thursday," I said. He did not deny it. Instead, he answered, "I visit my mother." "Your mother?" I repeated. "She would be glad to have you, I'm sure." "She lives far away," he said. "It's easier to visit here." And he smiled like a man who had been told to smile. His hand was cool as his answer sunk into me. "You visit her, sometimes." He stepped away, an excuse to leave, and then, as if his manners were a contract, he looked back. "You should not worry," he said. "Everything is being handled." That word, handled, sounded like a solicitor's brief. My stomach folded in on itself. "Handled by whom?" I asked. He said, "By those who are best prepared." I went home with the thin taste of metal on my tongue and a head full of clumsy questions. I opened the little wooden box that held the pearls and found, beneath the tissue, not only the scrap about durable power of attorney, but also a folded, roughly torn page that had once been part of a letter. The corner of the torn page had a smudge that looked like a thumbprint, and at the bottom, a single word, signature. I traced it with my finger and felt as if I were touching the lip of a well. The well wanted something. It wanted to know whether I would draw the water. I began, very carefully, to ask questions in the right places. I went to the bank where the trust for my late husband's small fortune was held, and I sat in a chair that smelled faintly of lemon-scented disinfectant and paper. The young woman at the counter, with a scholastic name tag, smiled the sort of smile that tries to convince you that bureaucracy is an act of kindness. "We can't discuss account details over the phone for privacy reasons," she said. "If the account holder authorizes you, you can receive information." "Authorizes me," I repeated. The words came out like pebbles. She sighed in the way of people who work under the weight of rules. "Do you have a durable power of attorney?" I thought of the scrap and the torn page. I thought of April 3rd. My mouth tasted like dishwater. "Not that I know of," I said. "Then we will need proof of kinship and identification," she said, in the uncompromising language of institutions that protect numbers and not hearts. I left with a stack of photocopies of my birth certificate and my wedding certificate and the memory of a clerk on April 3rd speaking in a room with his suit like a shield. The bank would not tell me more without permission. I walked back to my small apartment, and the mason jar felt heavier on the shelf. That night, I lay awake and listened to the sounds a well makes when it is being knotted, the distant hum of traffic, the soft creak of my bed, and the steady, distant clock in the hall. I thought of the pearls in the small box, like a promise I had made to myself to keep dignity like a locket. I thought of the chipped mug and how many breakfasts it had witnessed. And then I thought of the man who visited his mom every Thursday, a phrase that now sounded like a cipher. I resolved to keep. Watch Dumas once wrote that an offense against affection is a crime against the heavens. I confess with the small grandeur of those who have loved and been scorned that I understood him. You cannot place a price on a mother's vigil and expect the world to be moved. Yet the ledger of wrongs is always being kept by someone, if not by the courts, then by conscience. The night I decided to keep watch, I felt a small, dangerous flame kindle in me, the ember that would not let me sleep until the truth came, no matter how bitter. I had no idea then how stubbornly the world would test my flame. I never expected to open that drawer again and find what I would find. They said the truth would be like a candle in the wind. They lied. The truth arrived like a storm that knows the color of your roof and finds every loose tile. I spent days like a woman learning a new language. Only instead of verbs I learned dates. April 3rd, 3:15 p.m. April 17th, 10:00 a.m. May 12th, 8:00 p.m. I learned the names of documents as if they were the names of grandchildren. Durable power of attorney, last will and testament. Revocable living trust. Affidavit of forgery. Paper does not lie, the young people tell you, but ink can be taught to kneel before a greedy hand. When I first saw the photocopy of the durable power of attorney, the paper the bank had reluctantly produced after much arm-twisting, after I signed more forms than a person should ever have to sign in a lifetime, my heart felt like the hollow inside of a clock. The signature at the bottom was mine, or rather it looked like mine, the same curve on the M, the same stubborn angle on the Y. But it had a quality that made my teeth ache. It was too tidy, too smooth, like a dress rehearsal for the hand I knew. You learn to read a handwriting like you learn to read a weathered face. I had old letters, dozens, with flourishes and impatient crossings out, with the way my husband's script leaned like a man who had his thoughts ahead of his pen. I took the bank's copy and a sheaf of my own letters down to the small law office where a woman named Mr. Bennett had once fixed the latch on our porch free of charge and now kept the sort of memory that makes lawyers trustworthy. He was not young. His hair had the salt of many winters, and his eyes were the color of used books. He knew how to put trust in a phrase, and he had an honest hand. He looked at the two signatures and did not need to say much. He tapped the paper with a finger like a pious man touching a relic. "This one," he said, "was traced. The word lay on the table like a stone. Traced, as in someone had taken the measure of my life and drawn it in a pen that belonged to another." He explained in the language of his trade. The notary stamp was wrong. The seal had been applied with a pressure inconsistent with the documents I had signed at the bank decades ago. The notary's certificate was for an Angela M. Rutherford, and the supposed notary on April 3rd was listed as James P. Whitlow, a man whose notary number belonged to a different county. The photocopy showed a stamp with a date and an ink blot that could have been planted with the same hand that guided the pen. He looked up. "We can file an affidavit of forgery," he said. "But we will need more than handwriting. We need someone to say where the original was and who had access." I thought of the locked drawer in my daughter's study, the soft click of a latch that had become the sound of everything changing, and my mouth grew dry. "Who had access?" I whispered. The question landed like a bird in an empty room. "People who lived there," Mr. Bennett said, "and people who visited regularly, and those who tempted the ledger to their advantage." I left with Mr. Bennett's business card folded in my pocket like a flag and the photocopy of the durable power of attorney pressed to my chest as if it were a small animal that might be harmed. On my walk back, the pavement reflected my face in a dozen puddles. In each reflection, I looked smaller and more determined. I decided then I would be a woman with an agenda. I started where the smallest witnesses could lie and the largest truths hide, at the house itself. There are servants who keep records in the margins of their minds, who know which drawer holds the sugar and which holds the secrets. Rosa, the housekeeper who had been with them long before granite counters turned up and did not fuss for applause, had a way of folding towels that made me think of prayer. She noticed things because noticing was what she did to stay afloat in a world that would otherwise forget her. I took my courage like a coat and asked her for one small kindness, a cup of tea and a conversation. She had a face like warm bread, the sort of face that gives and receives comfort without calculation. She poured tea with hands that remembered both hunger and plenty. "I see you," she said softly. "You watch, and you?" I asked. She looked at me, and then with the quiet courage of women who know when a child's wontedness is being replaced by cunning, she said, "I keep small things. For me, to keep is to remember." She told me of a locked desk where envelopes were taken and placed aside, of a small white box that had come with the man in the black coat and had been kept on the second shelf of the pantry for a week. She told me of a night when my daughter had asked her to photocopy old letters and then to burn them after, and how she had refused and hidden one instead. "I cannot burn the past," Rosa said. "I am old, and I know how flies gather to theft." "You hid a letter?" My voice creaked with hope and fear like an old floorboard. Rosa nodded and reached under her apron. She produced a folded page, ragged at the edges, the ink smudged where salt had wept, and handed it to me with a look that felt like a benediction. It was a page from a letter my late husband had written long before his hands were still. He had written about the trust he intended for his family, and he had written my name as if it were an altar. At the bottom, in a hurried scrawl, were numbers that matched the figure the neighbor had whispered, $230,000. The paper bore no witness to any power of attorney, but it did have a margin note in my daughter's hand. "Handle after April 3rd. The margin note struck me like a bell. I held the paper like a talisman. "Why did you keep this?" I asked. Rosa's eyes softened. "Because I remember you," she said. "Because I remember when you would speak to my little boy like he was part of your own. I remember the soup you taught me to make and how you laughed. I cannot watch you be erased." That night I sat with the torn paper between my palms and thought of the mason jar. It felt less like thrifty superstition and more like a history of small resistances. The jewels of my past, the pearls and the mug and the coins, had become the maps I would follow. The world of lawyers and numbers is a precise place, but human beings are not precise. They leak. That leak, Mr. Bennett said, is where lies are discovered. My plan was not polished. I had no lawyer on retainer, no television cameras, nor a social media army. I had what I had always had: stubbornness, a neighbor's gossip, the truth of old letters, and a housekeeper who kept memories like treasure. I began to collect copies, memos, bank statements that showed withdrawals timed in the holidays. An envelope with a seal from Whitlow and Associates dated April 3rd, 2025 at 3:15 p.m. I made lists on the back of envelopes, my script shaky but legible. I scheduled times and spoke out loud to give the air something to hold. I went to the probate court clerk and asked politely for the dates of any filings. Names and times don't hide well in places that trade in them. There were humiliations, standing at a courthouse counter while a clerk typed in my name and a screen paraded a file I was not allowed to read. The clerk's glance that said, "We are impartial," which meant, "We have learned to be unreadable." There were small victories. The bank gave me, at last, the copy of a check written out to Whitlow and Associates for $5,000 on April 5th, 2 days after the durable power had been signed. A withdrawal here, a photocopy there. The thread began to reveal the tapestry. I learned the craft of patience. Dumas wrote that only in the watchman's vigil does the city reveal its villains. Only in the night does the traitor unmask. I felt like a watchman with a kettle at my side. I arranged for the retired notary, a man named Mr. Alvarez, who had been my husband's friend, to come and examine the documents. He had the look of someone who had pinned his life to integrity and would not remove the pin for any fashionable reason. "Forgery," he said after a long minute, holding the documents up as if they were moth-eaten cloth. "This signature was traced from a site. The pressure is wrong. The ink flow is inconsistent. The very blot on the T is a copy. Can we prove it?" I asked. "We can show the discrepancies," he said. "We can bring a challenge to probate. But you will need testimony. Someone must say under oath who had the originals and why they were not available." I thought of the man in the black coat. I thought of his gloved hands lifting shards from the broken frame. I thought of the way my daughter had laughed the last time we sat across from one another, and how her laughter had the quality of a curtain closing. There was a night, the sort that sits in your memory like a wet cloak, when I decided to entrap the truth, in the only place where all liars are forced into light. Speech, my granddaughter, lanky and forever a thing out of time, came by unexpectedly. She had the look of youth that has not yet learned cruelty. She is the sort of creature the years have not yet measured. We sat in the kitchen with the chipped mug between us, and she, unaware of the storm, hummed. I watched the doorway like a woman watching the tide. The man in the black coat had a habit of coming by more often of late, under the pretense of picking up mail or leaving packages. People who are making plans like to be near the post because the post is the body's movement. I placed a small recorder on the shelf beside the jars of spice, a ridiculous little thing the size of a biscuit, and set it to record. I am not proud of the trickery, but I have learned that a woman who fears injustice is permitted certain small deceptions. A trap is not noble, but it is necessary. I thought of the mason jar and how it had preserved pennies against storms. At exactly 8 p.m. on May 12th, someone knocked at the door. I remember the time as if it were the moment of a baptism. He arrived with the late light of the day still clinging to his cuffs. He came in and greeted me with the smile of a man who believes himself to be safe. "Good evening," he said. "I hope I'm not late." "You're on time," I said. He placed a small envelope on the counter as if it were a small sacrifice. My granddaughter made tea and left the two of us alone. I did not speak of the recorder. I had placed it so that an ordinary conversation would betray itself if any intention were in the air. He spoke like a man signing off on a job. "It's done. The bank has everything now," he said. She signed. "We will finalize the Revocable Living Trust after the gala, and then the distributions will take effect on June 28th. He sounded as a salesman might sound when removing packaging. Simple. Clinical. My ears did not like the stoicism of his tone. He mentioned June 28th as if it were a delivery date, rather than the day they intended to move the ground beneath my feet. "Who else knows?" I asked, and my voice sounded like a rope upon which too much tension had been placed. "Only the necessary parties," he said. "Mrs. Rutherford will be provided for in her usual way. It is quiet and efficient. No drama." He used the word efficient like an amuse-bouche. The recorder hummed quietly by the spices, as if it were a sleeping cat. "But she signed under durable power?" I asked in a calm I did not feel. He laughed then, a delicate thing, like someone who has been given permission to be cruel. "It was better this way," he said. "We acted on behalf of her intentions. She would have wanted things settled." My chest ached with the weight of his words. "Who told you that?" He shrugged, the movement of a man who likes to feel the world weigh, but does not bear it fully. "You don't want to know these things," he said. "Sometimes truth is messy. Best leave it be." "You don't decide what I want," I said, "and I will not lie." The sound my voice made surprised even me. It was the voice of a woman who had lived in kitchens and quarters and now found the courage of those rooms. The man in the black coat smiled and reached for his hat as if to be polite. "I must go now. There is work to do. Remember, June 28th is the day." As he left, the recorder kept its silent vigil. I sat for a while like a woman counting coins in prayer. The little biscuit-shaped recorder contained more than 40 minutes of his voice. When I played it back later under the dim lamp, every banal phrase became weighty. He had said things, small, careless things, about signing on April 3rd, about an originals box, about a note to be burned. He had mentioned the lawyer by name, James P. Whitlow. I went to the notary office where Whitlow's name rang on the brass plate like an accusation. A woman there confirmed she had once been a receptionist and had seen the man and his name on the schedule for April 3rd. But when I asked further, the receptionist's eyes slid away. "We've been told to refer all inquiries to Mr. Whitlow's legal counsel," she said. This was all a labor of small humiliations and great cunning. I had begun by collecting fragments, and the fragments were beginning to look like a map. I had Mr. Bennett to advise me, Mr. Alvarez to inspect the signatures, Rosa to hide letters like relics, and a recorder that had turned a man's casual cruelty into evidence. The stars inclined. Dumas once said, "In the world of law, the roar of justice is often muffled by velvet gloves." I add that velvet is often purchased by the same hands that would silence an old woman's voice. The law is a play and paper its script. We must learn to read with sharper eyes. At last, I made the choice that separates those who endure from those who act. I filed the affidavit of forgery. Mr. Bennett and I went to probate court on a Tuesday that smelled of rain and ink. We presented papers that had been assembled with the trembling of fingers that know how to gather courage from the gutters. The clerk, a man with a face like a ledger gone wrong, did not look surprised. The world has seen such things before, and wears the look of knowledge. We served notice to Whitlow and Associates, to my daughter, and to Whitlow's agent, the man in the black coat. The court stamped our papers with a weight that made me think of old grandfather clocks. The judge, a woman with hair like iron wool and a presence that makes honesty sit up, set a preliminary hearing for June 28, 2025 at 10 a.m. The date shone like a star on my calendar. I left the courthouse with my chest hollowed and my resolve blazing. This was the turning point in my life, the moment where once a mother might swallow grievance into herself and let poison go unspoken. I had chosen to go public, to drag our family laundering into a place where judges wore robes and asked inconvenient questions. I had chosen to make the private public. Before we could breathe, the storm rearranged itself. My daughter called in the evening, her voice smooth and practiced. "Mother," she said, "I know you've spoken to people. I think you should be careful. There are things you don't understand." "Like what?" I asked. "You will hurt yourself," she said. "You will hurt us." "Which us is that?" I asked, feeling a flame double in my ribs. "A family," she said. "There are consequences." I closed my eyes and saw the pearls in their tissue, the jar on the shelf. I thought of my husband's letters and of Rosa's face like warm bread. "Consequences," I repeated. "I know consequences. This is the consequence of letting others decide for me." We argued, not with fists, but with words that were like small knives sharpened at the wheel of history. She accused me of betrayal. I accused her of erasure. The air between us grew thin and brittle. We finished the call like two excellent actors who have just played a part terribly well. I had chosen a public path, and there is no returning from it. When you file for the truth, you drag your life into the sunlight and must accept whatever insects the light reveals. Families are like gardens. Some plants wilt when exposed. Before the hearing, I made one last trip to the house. Call it madness or courage, I went because those who start something tend to look back at the footprints to be sure they are still there. I had a letter from Rosa and the recorder's file in my handbag like contraband. My hand shook as I held the doorknob. Outside, the gardener trimmed hedges into sphinxes that seemed to observe me. I found my daughter in her study, the room where decisions had become ceremonies. She had not been expecting me, perhaps because she believed that I would take my small grievances and throw them into the compost of old wives' tales. She sat at her desk and looked like a woman whose life had been arranged by a clever tailor who knows which seams to pull to make a figure elegant. You should not be here, she said. I have a hearing on June 28th, I said. I have evidence of forgery. I have heard a man confess on a recording. I have letters that say handle after April 3rd. I have bank statements and photocopies and a man who traces my signature. What else do you want me to be? She smiled like a person who is emptying her pockets to show there is nothing to hide. You are being dramatic, she said. This will be dealt with quietly, Mother. For our good. For our good, I repeated. She stood then, and the room shifted like furniture in a storm. You don't understand how things are done in the world I live in, she said. There are protocols. Documents are updated. Money is moved. You think it all belongs to you, but the world changes. I fed you, I said. I sewed your dresses. I stayed up with your fever. I taught you to set a table so others would eat with grace. Her eyes narrowed, and then she laughed. A fast, cruel thing. You speak of gratitude like it is a receipt, she said. We are trying to help you. We are trying to make sure you do not have to worry. Make sure I do not have to worry, I echoed, by stealing my agency. She crossed toward me then, and the look on her face made me think of how a storm will gather birds on telephone wires. If you push this, she said in a voice ordered as a command, you will not only hurt us. There will be consequences. People will learn things. Old secrets will come out. Are you prepared for that? Secrets are overdue, I said. They have been late for too long. And in that instant, my chest stopped being small and began to be a bell. I did not know then where the strike would land. I only knew I could not go back. I had chosen the law, and the law had chosen a date. June 28th, 2025 at 10 a.m., Dumas' moral aside must be kept. When the oppressed chooses to stand, the earth trembles not because the oppressed are strong, but because injustice was never meant to be challenged. When a mother decides to name what was stolen, the universe rearranges like a ledger being balanced. I walked out of the house with my head held high and the sound of the study's closing door ringing like a knell. I would prepare for the hearing, and the lead up to it would be a war of papers, of witnesses, of old men with memory. I would have to be cleverer than I had ever been in my life. I started by making a list of witnesses who might speak: Rosa the housekeeper, Mr. Alvarez the notary, the bank clerk who had reluctantly coughed up a photocopy, and the retired neighbor who had seen Whitlow's car in the lane. I would, if necessary, summon the man in the black coat and force him to explain the envelope in his hand. Between now and June 28th, 1,000 small events conspired to build the stage. Envelopes arrived and were opened. A maid confessed in a tearful whisper that she had once seen the man in the black coat lift a wooden box from the shelf and place it under his arm. The gardener admitted to me, with a blush of fear, that he had seen the man leave at odd hours carrying a small sealed package. The world, which had seemed to conspire in my exclusion, now coughed up evidence like a patient coming to light. And then, in the last week before the hearing, the most damning piece of evidence appeared in my hands, not like a gift, but like an accusation. It came from an unexpected place, a courier's note left at my door, unsigned, with a small flash drive taped to the inside. When I put the flash drive into the old computer that still lived in my kitchen and clicked the file in the dim lamplight, I found a video, grainy, short but enough. It showed the man in the black coat, the lawyer Whitlow, and my daughter in a cramped office, their faces bright with the kind of success that tastes of someone else's dinner. Whitlow was showing them the original trust document, the one that contained the distribution of assets. He spoke of redistributing and of smoothing the transitions. My daughter nodded and at one point laughed and said, "It will be better if we simply make the durable power effective immediately." Whitlow then, in the video, said in a mild voice, "April 3rd is ready. We will be efficient." I watched the man in the black coat, close to the camera, reach for a pen and trace, ever so lightly, across the ink that could have been mine, as if to rehearse how to fake my hand. In that moment, the small, precise cruelty of the world was exposed. No longer a whisper, this was an act captured, as if conscience had been paused by a malfunctioning camera. The room spun slightly. The flash drive file was dated April 1st, 2025 at 2:47 p.m. It had been created and then deliberately sent to me like a grenade. Who would have done such a thing? I thought of enemies, of friends, and of the odd way the universe sometimes arranges comedy and justice. This was not a small theft any longer. This was a plot. I spent that night awake like those farm wives who watch storms push across the fields. I thought of the mason jar and the pearls and the chipped mug. I thought of the judge's scheduled date. I thought of the trembling in my hands, which was not all infirmity now, but the electricity of a woman who had chosen to stand. I resolved to bring the video to the court and to show the world, in its measured way, that the theft had been not accidental but deliberate. As the dawn creased the sky, I made one more decision that would define the time to come. I would confront them, not in whispers, not in letters, but in the public air of the courtroom. I would force the exchange of truth for their velvet. The turning point was not a sword, but a signature. I had the evidence. I had the date. I had the witnesses. I had decided to fight. There is no return from that decision, and yet, even as I prepared for combat with forms and affidavits, the house rearranged itself. My daughter's voice on the phone was ice with a kernel of warning. People who had been quiet began to speak rumors that were meant to wound, that perhaps I had been misremembering things, that perhaps the years had kindly removed my sharp edges and left a softer thing to sleep in the afternoon. They sent messages that said, "Be reasonable." They arranged, like predators, to make the public stage look like a courtroom and me like a bothersome spectator. I counted the days. June 28th would come upon us like a bell. I would stand in the light of the courtroom with the recorder in my hand and the flash drive cupped in my apron like contraband. I would not be alone. I had Mr. Bennett, Mr. Alvarez, Rosa, and the small community of witnesses who collected like birds before a storm. At midnight, on the eve of my confrontation, I placed the pearls in their box and wrapped the mason jar with a ribbon that had no color but the patience of many years. I lay awake and whispered to the room the only prayer I could make: let truth be my companion. Something shifted that night, as if the world had turned on a hinge and I could hear the grinding. I did not yet know whether I would be victorious. I only knew the shape of the fight. I never expected how loudly a house can speak when doors begin to close. The judge called the hour, and my heart answered it as if it were an old summons. June 28th, 2025 at 10 a.m. stood on my calendar like a date with fate, and I entered the courtroom with my knitting case of papers and the small, biscuit-sized recorder and the flash drive tucked in the pocket of my coat. The courthouse smelled of lemon cleaner and old paper. It had the precise, indifferent air of a place built to measure wrongs. Mr. Bennett walked beside me like a man who carries both a lamp and a burden. Mr. Alvarez came too, with the slow dignity of those who know what pens mean. Rosa stood in the hallway like a prayer, folding her hands while the gardener, pale with worry, kept his head down like someone who had once dug graves and now feared to dig any deeper. The courtroom was a small theater. Portraits of sober men looked down. The bailiff announced the case. Rutherford vs. Whitlow and Associates, petition to determine validity of durable power of attorney. Affidavit of forgery alleged. Saying those words felt like calling out a conjuration. All the people inside, clerks, court reporter, and a woman with hair like iron wool whom I had grown to respect, leaned forward slightly, as if the old house might tip. I felt like an actor taking a stage I had no right to inhabit and yet had long prepared for in the silent rehearsals of nights with my mason jar and my chipped mug. They led my daughter in as if she were a guest rather than an accused. She wore a coat of tailored indifference, and her smile was the sort of thing one irons for public use. Whitlow sat with the ease of a man who thinks he can explain everything away with phraseology. The man in the black coat, who, God help him, had no proper name in public papers, but whose hands I could describe down to the small scar on his thumb, sat in the back and looked as if he were waiting for a bus that had already left. The judge, Mrs. Hargrove, nodded to me with the few lines of gravity that make you believe a person can hold you. "Mrs. Rutherford," she said, "you filed an affidavit of forgery on May 14th, 2025, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said. My voice was small, and yet it carried the weight of kitchens and lullabies. "Mr. Bennett, you wish to call your first witness." Mr. Bennett stood and moved like a sensible man. He called Mr. Alvarez first. The old notary took the stand with a cane and a face like a map of common decency. He explained, in the courteous language that makes facts bearable, the differences in pressure, the way ink flows when a hand intends, and how it shivers when it is emulated. He pointed to the photocopy of the durable power of attorney dated April 3, 2025, at 3:15 p.m., and then to genuine documents dated from the 1990s and early 2000s that demonstrated my steady, irregular scrawl. "The April 3rd signature is traced," he said clearly, and the word landed on the air like a verdict in a small parish. I watched my daughter's face as Mr. Alvarez spoke. For a fleeting moment, a child I had known peered through. Then the curtain came down, and she became whatever armor she had paid for. Whitlow's counsel tried to poke holes, asked technical questions that smelled of preparation. The defense attempted to distract with niceties of legal procedure, but the judge listened, and the courthouse has a memory like an animal. After Mr. Alvarez, Rosa took the stand. She trembled at first, and I thought perhaps she would fold like a thin note. But her voice steadied as she told of the wooden box on the pantry shelf, of photocopies asked, then ordered burned, of the nights the man in the black coat came and left with the little white envelopes. She held the torn margin note, handle after April 3rd, aloft like a banner. The gardener testified about packages taken under his arm in the early hours. A bank clerk testified with the weary candor of someone who has seen checks and signatures and remembered when the ordinary person matters. When the courier's video played, grainy and small, it was as if the room inhaled. There they were. Whitlow, my daughter, the man in the black coat, and the original trust document that showed the distribution of $230,000 intended by my late husband. The moment where the man in the black coat traced the ink, the rehearsal of a forgery, was plain and vulgar in its slowness. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a captured act. I sat then and felt the world weigh differently. A small sentence crept into my ribs. They cannot unsee this. The defense attempted to argue entrapment and contamination, that the video might have been doctored, that sounds could be taken out of context. Whitlow's counsel produced an affidavit claiming that power had been consented to for the purposes of financial consolidation and simplifying estate management. My daughter spoke briefly. With the practiced flinty quality of someone who believes in her own narrative, she spoke of efficiency and best intentions and tried to frame their actions as a kindness, that they had sought to shelter me from the complications of managing money. Her voice slid into the space like a sleek animal, but the law has its little iron tools. It likes witnesses and dates. The flash drive had the metadata showing April 1st, 2025, 2:47 p.m., when Whitlow and the man in the black coat discussed activating the durable power immediately after their staged signature. The bank records showed a $5,000 payment to Whitlow and Associates on April 5, 2025 as a retainer. Other transfers were scheduled for the end of certain months. Envelopes burned were recounted by Rosa. The web of small acts had been pulled tight and now shone with the inevitability of a noose. Dumas once said in a fashion that made the spine shiver, "When falsehood builds a palace, truth will at last become its architect's enemy." When law pulls at the tapestry of guile, the threads reveal their maker. In the cross-examination, Whitlow attempted to distance himself, to say that he had merely advised, that his actions had been within the scope of client instructions, and that the signatures were simply updated administrative changes. That is the manner of men practiced in bending words to make a theft sound like housekeeping. But Mr. Bennett was deliberate. He showed the torn letter from my husband, the margin note, the video. He asked quiet, devastating questions. "Did you instruct anyone to trace Mrs. Rutherford's signature? Was the notary stamp applied by your office on April 3, 2025? The answers pulled like two surfaces, trying to be different but sticking because of the truth. The man in the black coat swore he had been an agent acting on instructions. His testimony scattered like brittle leaves. He had no standing, no legal title, and the video made the malicious ease of his tasks clear. The court reporter typed in a cadence that felt like the tick of some moral clock. When the defense tried to smear my competence, suggesting that I was vulnerable due to age and that what they did had been for my well-being, the room held its breath. I felt a fierce thing in my chest. Not only the heat of anger, but the cool of dignity settling in. I had taught my daughter how to set a table. I would now ask the court to set right what the table had hidden. The judge, when she finally spoke, had that look of iron wool and clear justice. The evidence of a video in which counsel and third parties discuss making the durable power effective and in which an individual appears to simulate a signature, she said slowly, is substantial. The court finds cause for concern as to the validity of the April 3, 2025, durable power of attorney and the subsequent changes to the revocable living trust. The judge ordered an immediate temporary injunction preventing any disbursements from the trust and appointed an independent trustee to oversee the funds pending further determination, a modest, surgical mercy that would keep the money from being moved while the truth was sorted. She also referred the matter to the district attorney for investigation into potential criminal charges of forgery and conspiracy. The public nature of this referral was a small hammer blow. In a world of velvet gloves, the sound is understood. My daughter's face went pale in a way that shaved her of color like lightning would shave a tree of leaves. Whitlow's counsel sat with his tie suddenly heavier. The man in the black coat looked for the first time like a child caught with a jar of stolen cookies. The verdict for that morning was not the final verdict, but it was a pivot. The court had listened and had acted to prevent further harm. Outside the courthouse, the press had already arrived, small local outlets at first, then a television crew who asked questions with microphones like insects. Photographers circled my daughter in her tailored coat, capturing the look of someone who had believed the world would hide their deeds. Her friends began to unfriend her in public ways that her small cruelties multiplied. The charity board asked her to step down until matters were resolved. The portrait in the charity's newsletter was quietly removed, and the webpage scrubbed with the efficiency of someone who believes reputation to be their earthly coin. They were, in the currency that matters now, losing more than money. The falling action tightened like a rope. I pressed my palm to the mason jar that evening and felt old currencies and new. I had not expected lovers of mine, those little steady things like teacups and recipes, would become allies. The mason jar, the pearls, the chipped mug, the letters, all had been tiny testimonies to a life, and they had now become instruments of my vindication. Rosa came to sit with me and we stitched quietly an afternoon garment out of minutes. She blessed me with the small, ordinary kindness of women who have lived long together and know the cost of dignity. The DA's investigators dug in with the appetite of those who must make sense of human cunning. They subpoenaed Whitlow's office records. They sought the originals from wherever they might be hidden. They traced the courier's origin to a private email sent from an account linked to one of Whitlow's paralegals. During the investigation, Whitlow's license became the subject of a professional review. He was suspended pending inquiry by the state bar. The man in the black coat, who had been nothing more than an instrument for others, was arrested on charges of conspiracy and forgery after investigators found duplicate originals in his possession and receipts for payments. It was a humiliating fall for him. An officer placed his hands behind his back with the careful firmness of someone putting a book back on a shelf. When Whitlow's office doors were opened for inspection, there was an odor of stale tobacco and filing cabinets with empty spaces where documents should have been. Investigators found irregular notary logs and a number of suspicious envelopes. The public records showed $5,000 on April 5, 2025, and a series of transfers suspiciously aligned with the modifications to the trust. My daughter's involvement was more complicated to prove criminally. Intent is a cruel and slippery thing in the eyes of the law. But the court of social opinion had already rendered its sentence. Her name, once announced with pride at charity events, was now whispered in the corridors of friends and colleagues. Invitations declined themselves into polite notes. There were moments of private sorrow between the legal turns. I thought often of my husband, of his small virtues, and of how he would have cursed and sighed in equal measure at our modern complications. I thought of the nights I had lain awake and whispered to the ceiling like a child telling secrets. I wondered whether the first betrayal had been born of necessity or of greed, and whether any apology could rebuild what had been broken. Dumas wrote that revenge is an onion that makes us cry. He was both right and cruel. I did not wish revenge for its own sake. I wanted restoration. One morning, not long after the injunction, my daughter came to my apartment unannounced. She stood at the door like a woman waiting to be admitted to court. Her face was washed of the armor of before. The tailor's smoothness had been unstitched by events. "Mother," she said, voice thin like a weathered ribbon. "Come in," I said. I had a biscuit on the plate and the chipped mug filled with tea. She sat, her hands folded, where I had once folded her own small hands to teach her patience. The room smelled of chamomile and the faint smoke of old books. There is a fatigue that settles in faces when someone has been watched by the public. It strips even artifice down to the bone. "You should have warned me," she said. "You should have trusted me." I looked at the woman who had once been my child and felt the complex tenderness of someone who had both raised and been astonished by them. "Trust is difficult when it has been sold," I said. "But you were my child and always will be," she began to speak, halting and with tears that tasted like old things. She apologized in fits and starts, for what exactly she could not always name. She apologized for the pain she had caused, for the decisions made, for the coldness she had shown. I listened with the patience of a woman who has learned that some apologies are seeds and must be planted in firm soil to take root. I did not know then whether the apology was true or a politeness, but it was the first honest thing she had placed in my hands in a long while. "Will you forgive me?" she asked finally, an ancient question. Forgiveness is a generous currency, and I have always been careful with money. I thought of the mason jar, how I had kept it tight against storms, and of the pearls now returned to their tissue by choice rather than necessity. I said, "I do not know if I can forget, but I can begin to mend." We did not embrace like stage scenes in novels. We sat and had tea like two people who had survived much. My daughter, humbled by public collapse and the slow work of the law, began in time to take small steps to repair what she had broken. She repaid, to the trust under court supervision, certain sums that had been wrongfully disbursed. She resigned from public boards and took leave from her positions. It was not complete restitution, nor would any money replace the quiet years of neglect. But it was a movement toward repair. The court supervised an accounting, and the independent trustee worked to restore the trust to the intent expressed in my late husband's writings. The injunction was lifted only after the probate court found the April 3, 2025 durable power to be invalid, and the unauthorized trust modifications void. Whitlow, for his part, faced disbarment proceedings, and the state bar revoked his license after he was found to have acted in reckless disregard for the integrity of the notarial process. Criminal charges against him, and the man in the black coat proceeded. The man in the black coat pled guilty to forgery and conspiracy and received a sentence that removed his liberty for a term and burdened him with restitution. Whitlow faced both civil and criminal consequences. His name was no longer spoken in polite company, the way it had once been. The charity gala where my daughter had presided saw her absent, and a notice posted that she had stepped down pending personal matters. Her social world, as fragile as porcelain, cracked and could not be invisibly repaired. Poetic justice does not always come in dramatic guillotines. Often it arrives in the quieter form of consequence, reputations untethered, licenses revoked, friendships evaporated. Men of law thought themselves above human retribution, but the law has instruments that occasionally bite. The public unmasking was a slow and thorough humiliation, and in that there was a kind of justice. And yet, I confess, the truest restoration was not only the money, but my regained independence. The court ordered that the $230,000 be held in trust with me as the beneficiary and with the independent trustee, a careful, watchful professional, to distribute funds for my welfare and to ensure my safety from future machinations. The money, under a stern but fair administration, paid for repairs to my apartment, a new washer, and a small trip to the sea with Rosa, because women of our age cannot only exist in grudges. Sometimes we must also live the lives we still have. The mason jar remained on its shelf, less for necessity and more for ritual, and the pearls returned to be worn at the occasional lunch with friends who still believed in me. Dumas once taught that the dark arts of human cunning are best answered by patient justice, not by petty revenge. Let history judge those who steal the dignity of elders. Let it also remember that patience, when combined with courage, is formidable. I will not pretend that everything healed like a handkerchief, dampened and folded. Some relationships were rent too far to be stitched. There were people who turned away forever, and I learned to accept the silence of some rooms. But dignity was restored. My name returned to the ledger that had nearly erased me. The restoration was not merely financial. It was the world saying in a formal, bureaucratic voice that someone had been wronged and that the wrong would be named. In the months after the judgment, I found myself at a small table, the pearls around my throat, a speakerphone occasionally placed next to the mason jar as friends called to check on me. The neighborhood found a new rhythm. The gardeners continued to shape hedges into sphinxes, and the daily bread of human existence resumed its modest turning. My granddaughter, who had watched the spectacle with the bewildered loyalty of youth, visited more often and learned to say my name in a way that made it whole. Rosa and I shared recipes and laughter. The man in the black coat served his sentence in a small cell and had time to think. Whitlow's office was shuttered, and his name, once embossed on leather, was smudged by the rain of consequence. The last formal act of the court, a small but necessary signature, returned to me a document that recognized the revocable living trust modifications as null and void, and affirmed the original intent of my husband's last will and testament. There was a formal apology written by Whitlow's counsel, a ritual that smacked of law's attempt at gentle closure. It did not return years, but it returned a vital thing, the assertion that my life was not valueless. I learned, in the hush that followed, another lesson that Dumas himself might have admired. Justice is not a sudden sword, but a long, often tedious loom. Threads must be pulled, witnesses called, and the patience of many must be endured. When truth is your ally, you will find the way to the light, but it takes time and a stubbornness like mine. If my story has any purpose beyond the small comfort of truth served, let it be this: do not assume that the hands that fed you as a child will always be gentle in later life. Guard small things, keep letters, photograph papers, know the names of documents, durable power of attorney, revocable living trust, last will and testament, affidavit of forgery. Date them carefully. Keep receipts. Keep friends who remember your soup recipe. I keep my mason jar because it taught me how little things collect into defenses. I do not close with a tale of revenge. I close with one of restoration and dignity. The world has a way of balancing its scales, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully. But balance comes when people choose to name injustice rather than hide from it. If my story touched you, share it with someone who needs courage today. Tell your old ones you remember them. Keep their letters. Check their papers. Listen when they say, "This was always mine." And subscribe if you would like more of my little truths and the secrets of a life that learned to be brave late in the afternoon. Leave a comment. Tell me if you have a mason jar or a chipped mug or a story that needs telling, and we will sit and talk like old friends.